It's green now. Thank you, sir. All right. So we have Jesus before Annas. And we talked a little bit about on Wednesday night, I guess it was. I do something wrong. We talked a little on Wednesday night about the fact, John clearly says that Annas was high priest. He identifies him in that way. Initially, as you read, it's like, okay, is he saying Annas was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, who was high priest? And that seems pretty clear. But then as you continue on, it's clear that John identifies Annas as high priest. But then he also mentions that Caiaphas was high priest that year. And so we talked a little bit about the fact that it seems that in first century Rome, one of the things that they did with the Jews was that they would appoint a high priest. I don't know that it was necessarily every year, maybe just whenever they got a whim or when they didn't like the way the high priest was running things at the time. But one of the things that Rome would do is appoint a high priest who had been appointed by them. Well, under Jewish culture and the law of Moses, the high priest typically was chosen as the descendant of Aaron, that particular part of the family line, and they served for life. And so it seems at least that Annas was the high priest that the Jews recognized, but Caiaphas was the high priest that the Romans recognized. And so, as I said on Wednesday night, it became important for the Jews, as though they were really concerned about following the letter of the law. It became important to them in order to get the conviction that they were looking for Annas to sign off on it so the Jews were satisfied, but for Caiaphas to sign off on it so that the Romans were satisfied. And ultimately, it was Rome who was going to have to put Jesus to death, which is interesting in and of itself. They didn't have the right to put anybody to death. They make that statement to Pilate, but did they always follow that? Seemingly? Give me an example of somebody they put to death that we know of. It's in Scripture. A few years from now. Stephen. Did they seem to have any qualms about stoning Stephen? No, but there's a sense in which, if you think about it, the contrast between Stephen and Jesus. In the grand scheme of Jewish culture, was Stephen anybody? No. Was Jesus? Jesus was well known among the people. Now, whether or not he was widely popular at the time of his death is a whole nother ball of wax. But he was at least well known among the people. And there have been times, remember, when they were afraid to arrest Jesus because of what? Because they thought it might cause an uprising. They thought the people might revolt and riot against them, and so they didn't want to do that. So Jesus was at least well known. He was a well-known Jew. Whether he was well respected among the masses or not is irrelevant. He was well known, and so this was a high stakes case, and they had to make sure that they dotted their I's and crossed their T's. So they bring him before Annas. In the middle of the night, seemingly, there are no witnesses that we're told about anyway, and doesn't seem to have been a gathering of the Sanhedrin Council, which was supposed to be a part of any capital crime in which they were planning on putting someone to death. But they bring him before Annas, and Annas has the chance to question Jesus during the nighttime hours. I'm going to throw out my speculation. Presumably, he was kept busy by Annas while they got the council together and got everybody else that was necessary for the secondary trial. That was the important one before they passed him on to the Romans. So that's my 2 cents. Whether or not that's really what's going on or not, I think that was part of what this was. So Annas comes first as opposed to Caiaphas because they're trying to get everybody else together, and because the Jews need him to sign off on this death so that the Jewish people recognize that the high priest that you recognize believes he is a criminal worthy of death. So it seems to be, if I follow John's chronology, that it's while he's at the household of Annas on trial that the whole events of what takes place with Peter, or at least a significant portion of it, takes place. That seems to be the courtyard where people had gathered together. I don't know whether these are the soldiers that brought Jesus back or if there were others who were there. But it's in this courtyard that Jesus is taken into, and that John seemingly is also able to go into. Why do I say that? I mean, if you look at the context of what John says, what do we know about John from what's revealed here? Okay, he had a connection to someone there. He was well known in the high priest's household, and so he seems to be permitted to come into the courtyard and to be there in that place. I think that's significant because what had happened just maybe a few hours ago or a few minutes before, I don't know how long it was from their journey from the Mount of Olives to the high priest's court. But what had happened? When Jesus was arrested, what did they do? What did the 11 do? They all fled. And so as Jesus stands trial here at Annas's court, John seems to come back to be in close proximity of what's going on. And I say that because when Peter comes to see what's going on, which is also, I think, significant for us to look at, Peter tries to come and be closer to Jesus and see what's going to transpire and all that too. But he's not permitted to come in. So what happens?
John apparently talks to
one of his connections and says, I'll vouch for him. And so Peter is permitted to come inside. And isn't it amazing that what Peter sees as an opportunity to be near Jesus and the events of what's happening, Satan sees as an opportunity? I think that's a lesson for us. I mean, here Peter is trying to essentially reconnect himself to Jesus, which is a good thing, right? I mean, he had fled, and now he is trying to get back closer to him again, to see what's going to happen. I mean, maybe he thinks there's some possibility he can do something to help matters, but he tries to get back closer to Jesus, and Satan sees that as an opportunity, his opportunity to step in, and sees an opportunity to tempt and test Peter. And Satan does that. Well, we sometimes think that Satan only uses times when we're weak and when we're straying and wandering. But here Peter is trying to come back, so to speak, and Satan sees that as an opportunity to test him or to tempt him. And so what happens? While he's here in the courtyard, what happens? Okay, so this lady recognizes him and says, "You also are not one of this man's disciples, are you?" She doesn't make a statement. She doesn't make an accusation. It's like, yeah, you look familiar. Aren't you one of the guys who was following him before? And Peter says, no, I'm not. Okay, so that is this particular time. And then there's the questioning of Annas in this particular place. And then we have the other instances of Peter's denial. So did they all happen during this same time frame? My guess is yes. But it may also be that this one happens and then he moves on to Caiaphas and another one or two happens in that place. That aspect of the chronology, I mean, you do what you will with it. But because really after the denial, after Annas' trial and the denial, he just quickly mentions that they moved to Caiaphas's house and then on to Pilate. So which happened first in this instance? I don't know. If you read the other accounts, I think it makes it a little bit more complicated to figure out exactly when these denials take place. We read them and it's almost as though they happen back to back to back to back really quick. Well, I guess it's back to back to back, just three, really quickly. But it may have been over the course of several hours that these things took place, as far as the statements made by various onlookers and then the denial by Peter. But we'll talk a little more about that. We're not going to leave that completely because there's a significant detail that's found in the Gospel of Luke that I don't think we should overlook, don't want to miss. Jim's got something. One of the things I meant to give you for homework before today, but you may have already looked at it, and we probably will be talking about it this morning and also on Wednesday, but I want you to look at the various accusations that are made about Jesus. And I want you to contrast in your mind at least, and we'll talk about it a little bit in class, the difference between what he's accused of before the Jews and what he's accused of before the Romans, because I think it's significant. Jim.
Yeah, Peter, if he'd have had the same attitude in that denial that he had in Acts 5, he'd been in good shape, wouldn't he?
Yes.
He said, we ought to obey God rather than man.
That's right. And I mean, and we've talked about that a little bit. The wavering of the disciples here is, you know, I mean, we look at it and I know we're saddened by it and we think they shouldn't have done that and clearly they shouldn't. But there are aspects of who Jesus is and what Jesus has come to do that they're still not clear on. And it doesn't become fully clear to them, seemingly, until after the resurrection and his ascension. But after that, they're clear. And I mean, as Jim said, Peter and John are the ones who stand firmly and say, we're going to keep teaching what we're teaching, and we can't stop talking about these things in spite of the threats that are made against them, threats not only of physical harm, but ultimately even death. Yes, sir.
Not knowing the mind of Peter, you can imagine as he's standing there warming himself and this accusation comes, he'd have to have thought a little bit about where he is and the risk that's involved.
Absolutely.
And I wonder how much justification he made for telling just a little lie.
Right.
And felt okay about that until he recognized that it played into Jesus' prophecy about him denying him. He probably didn't even think he was denying Christ when he did that. It was just, I'm on a recon mission here. I'm out trying to figure out what's going on, and the rest of the disciples are scattered, and I need to bring them back some information, let them know what's going on, let them know when our time to regroup is, and all. I mean, so you can just kind of imagine how we lie to ourselves,
Right.
and justifying things that are contrary to.
Well, that's right. I mean, and you bring up a good point. I mean, there are times where we think it's justified to tell a little lie or do, just a little something because the greater good is in mind. But inevitably, when we do that, when we sidestep the law of God in order to accomplish whatever we think's in the best interest of the situation, inevitably, what will Satan make sure we have to do? We'll have to do it again. I mean, and so Peter could very well, as Greg said, have justified that, well, I'm on a recon mission here. I'm trying to figure out what's going on so I can maybe help the situation. And so, I mean, what would have happened if he'd have just straight up said, yeah, I'm his disciple? I mean, likely, in the environment that he's in, what's going to happen? He's going to be right up there next to him on trial. I mean, it's possible they would have just been like, oh, okay. We've got bigger fish to fry right now. You're nobody. But it's possible he could have ended up in lots of trouble. And so we can see how Peter could justify in his mind. I'm not really denying him. I'm just going to make this statement and we'll move on. But it's not just this time. And it doesn't end up being just a simple, no, I'm not his disciple. In the end, there's a lot more to it. And so, as I said, when we try to sidestep what God has revealed for what we consider to be the greater good, Satan will always find a way to make sure that we have to compromise again. And then the compromises become a little easier. We've got to continue the lie in order to keep the whole charade.
I was just thinking about it's real easy to say, oh, if we were Peter, we would have done things so much differently. But to just think about his emotional state and what he was doing and choosing to do. And I was just thinking about Jesus in the garden when he says, Jesus says, I'm here. Let them go. Did Jesus want Peter to be in danger at that time? No, he specifically says, let them go. And then promptly, what does Peter do? He follows him towards the trial. He's going towards danger. And it's like, Peter, you're not ready to stand against the powers that be yet. You can't even stand against the servants in the courtyard. You don't have that sort of conviction yet. Satan has asked for you. I've prayed for you. You're not ready yet. I'm here, let these people go. And Peter promptly marches right into the lion's mouth, effectively. And lo and behold, what happens? He's, to use that phrase, sifted like wheat, or at least that's what the devil's trying to do.
Both by the fire of the enemies. And he's putting himself exactly where Jesus doesn't want him to. Of course, we know Jesus knew that's exactly what Peter was going to do. I mean, knowing Peter's character at this point, that's what we'd expect him to do. He's the one that drew the sword in the garden, not really thinking about, I think, the overall consequences of that. I mean, like I said, the likelihood was not only were they outnumbered in the garden, there were those two swords that the disciples had probably weren't the only swords. So the chances that he and whoever else had a sword were going to break things free was unlikely. But that was Peter. I mean, he does grow to his credit, and develops the kind of faith that he needs and becomes the kind of servant that Jesus needs him to be. And that's a lesson for us too, that regardless of where we are, we can, with God's help, become what he wants us to be. Jim?
Yeah, Peter is like you and I. He had his weaknesses, but he's a unique character because he's willing to take on the whole bunch with a sword,
Yes. Yeah, I mean, that was Peter. I mean, and like I said, I don't know whether he thought about the full ramifications of it or not. My guess is no. But to his credit, he at least tried to do something, even if it wasn't going to work, and even if it wasn't really what needed to be accomplished. In his mind, he was trying to do the right thing. The important thing is for us to learn what the right thing really is. So, the high priest questions Jesus. And we don't have a whole lot about that. He questioned Jesus, verse 19 says, about his disciples and his teaching. I don't know what he's asking about his disciples unless he wants to know who they are so he can round them all up too. But anyway, he asks about Jesus' disciples and his teaching. And Jesus makes a statement here. What does he say?
I've openly taught. This is what you've heard. Why do you question me?
Well, and here's the important thing to understand. This was not some smart aleck answer by Jesus. This was not him making light or downplaying the significance of the high priest. In cases like this, where it was a capital offense, under Jewish law, it wasn't the testimony of the person that was necessary for a conviction. In fact, they weren't allowed to convict on the basis of the testimony of the individual alone, because the law of Moses said, by the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses, let the facts be established. And so Jesus' point, in some ways perhaps, is the same one that Paul uses later, and that is to just talk about the nature of what the court was supposed to involve. I mean, here you are asking me questions about my teaching and whether or not it's in line with the law. What you're doing right now is not in accordance with the law, and you're the high priest. And again, I don't know that Jesus was necessarily pressing his rights so much as just calling attention to the events for the benefit of those who were there. I don't think Paul was necessarily doing that, questioning for his own rights, as much as he was trying to lead people to see the corruption of Judaism and the law as a whole, and then later even Romanism, and the benefits of following the only true and living God. And so the nature of truth is really what's at stake here. Is Annas really concerned with the truth? If he was, then when Jesus was present in the temple, preaching and teaching these things, what would Annas have been doing? He would have been asking questions about that. And he would have been contrasting and comparing what Jesus was teaching with what the law revealed, and seeking to understand, does he fulfill the prophecies as he says, or does he not? But was he doing that? Were many in the Jewish leadership doing that? What were they doing? I mean, pretty much the whole time, as far as what we can see.
Making a plan against him.
They were looking for ways to trap him and making a plan against him. Because of jealousy, because they saw him as a threat to their way of life. Whatever. I think both of those go into it. I know later Pilate says, or it says that Pilate understood that they had handed him over because of envy or jealousy. But there are multiple things at stake here in the minds of different people in the leadership. But the point is, there seem to have been very few among the Jewish leaders who were honestly examining what Jesus was teaching and saying, and had begun the whole process with questioning him and his authority, not in the way that we would expect them to, because there's a sense in which even Nicodemus does that when he comes to him at night. Who are you, and what are you really about? And that's okay from the standpoint of doing it with an honest and open heart. And the end result is Nicodemus became a believer and a follower of the things of Jesus. But the Jewish leadership as a whole wasn't that way. Their questions are not honest. They're not really seeking. They're looking for ways to trap him so they can incriminate him and charge him. And so that's perhaps part of what Jesus says here is, I did this openly. It's not like I did it in secret. And at any time, if you'd wanted to ask me questions and really find out who I am, you could have done that. Jim. And then Greg's got something.
Yeah, those people, they were not looking for truth. They were seeking for liars, and they was having difficulty finding 2 liars tell the same lie the same way.
Well,
And some of them seem to think that when Jesus was silent, that he was showing silent contempt for their ungodliness.
yeah, that's possible. It's also a part of the prophecy. And the other part is, his being silent. Greg had something also up here, Chuck. Another part of him being silent, what does Proverbs say? Answer a fool according to his folly, and what? You'll be seen as a fool. Jesus himself said in Matthew chapter 7, don't throw your pearls before swine, right? Are they listening? Have they listened from the beginning? Is anything going to change now? Is there anyone present who's going to listen? And I think that's part of the point. I think there are times when Jesus would speak because he knew there was at least someone present who might hear and believe and understand. His silence may indicate, I say may, this is my speculation, his silence may indicate there's nobody even around to listen to the truth who cares about it. So there are multiple reasons Jesus might have been silent in a portion of this. Greg.
Clear, and I wasn't here, but so it says Caiaphas was the one who advised Jews it's expedient for one man to die on behalf of the people. Did you talk about that verse already?
We didn't this time because I know we had talked about it before.
Okay.
When
Well,
he made the
so
prophecy.
Caiaphas is not a believer,
No.
is he? So how do you justify that verse? I think, and Annas may have been one that believed the same thing. It's that when he said, "Why don't you talk to people?" What angered them may have been, well, they're trying to prevent an insurrection from drawing the attention of the Roman authorities and causing harm to thousands and thousands, or maybe millions of Jews.
Right.
And so, from a human standpoint, that may have been a logical reason to suppress what you think is just a false prophet.
Absolutely.
It puts the people at risk. So we talked about it endangers their position. That is true.
That's right.
They were deceivers. That's still true.
Right.
But there may have been some that were at least trying to do the right thing towards the people. That would backfire on them, but still, their motives may have actually been, from a human standpoint, justifiable as opposed to just
Right.
self-interest.
Absolutely. I mean, I think there were probably, we talked about one of the disciples was Simon the Zealot. The Zealots were a group of Jews who saw the way of overthrowing Rome as being physical and ultimately overthrowing them somewhat in the way that the Maccabees did with some of the Greeks. And so there were some among them who saw the Messiah not as a spiritual liberator, but as a physical liberator, and would have seen standing behind someone like a Jesus who was gaining a following as being a good thing for the benefit of the nation. So they weren't seeing him as he really is, but would have been seeing him as one who could liberate the nation and free them from Roman rule and all those kinds of things. So I have no doubt Greg's right. There were a whole host of reasons for why people among the Jewish leadership were doing what they were doing. And that's what I said a minute ago. Pilate said he knew that they had handed him over because of envy. That's true of some of them. They didn't want to lose their place as the teachers of the law and the ones who were the leaders of the people. But I have no doubt that there were some among them who saw Jesus as a threat to their way of life and to their safety among Rome, and that he had to be stopped at all costs because otherwise the nation as a whole is going to pay. And so I have no doubt that that was the case. And I mean, there may have been other reasons for which some people saw Jesus as a threat that needed to be dealt with. But the bottom line is, what's more important? Seeing the truth as it really is, or creating the truth in our own mind? This is important because we live in a culture in 21st century America where people want to make the truth what they want it to be because, I mean, and again, there are a whole host of reasons. Because it's comfortable, because they like the people that they worship with, because, whatever the reasons are, ultimately the truth as they see it is more comfortable than the truth as God revealed it. Which is more important to us? The whole truth, the truth. And the only place that truth ultimately comes from is where? It's from Scripture. I mean, the truth that we can know for sure, the absolute truth is revealed by God. And so if God wants us to live in a certain way, does it matter how we feel about it? I mean, in the end, there used to be, I heard people talk about, there was a series of bumper stickers. I think this was back in the 70s maybe. Someone said, God said it, I believe it. That settles it. And someone then decided to make another bumper sticker that said, God said it, that settles it. And that's the bottom line. Does it matter, in the end, does it matter whether you believe what God has revealed or not? Who's the only person that matters for? Really? It's you. Because whether or not you believe it's irrelevant. Is it still true? If God said it, is it still true? Whether you believe it or not, it's still true. I mean, if the barometer, there was a story told years ago, and I mean, stories get repeated over and over so much they become like fish stories. And so I don't know whether it's true or not. There was a story told, I think it was in the early 1900s. They had old time barometers, and at one point the barometer down on the coast, I think it was the Gulf Coast, dropped so low the guy thought it was broken and he shattered it. Shortly after that, the largest hurricane that had been recorded struck the coast and devastated it. Did him breaking the barometer change what was coming? The fact that he didn't want to believe the instrument and therefore shattered it, did that change the truth? No, the storm still came. And so if we say, oh, God is love and he would never consign anyone to hell, if we say that, does that change anything? No. In the grand scheme of things, it changes nothing. If God has said it, it's true, and that settles it. The only person that it matters for whether or not I believe it is me, and maybe the people I have the opportunity to influence. But bottom line is, God said it, that settles it. So the truth is revealed by God, and we can be confident of that truth. It is absolute. And so that's what we have to learn and know. And so these people making all their justifications for the reason that they were treating Jesus the way that they were and ultimately putting him to death doesn't change the truth. And the truth is that Jesus is the Son of God. He is the great I am. He is Jehovah God. He is all those things. He is the first and the last. And so he's all those things that the scripture identifies him as. And now, because he allowed them to put him to death, he is our Savior and our Redeemer by his blood. So they can do what they want to because God let them in this instance. But ultimately, it doesn't change anything about who he is. Yes, sir.
You're talking about truth. People look at the truth different ways. I noticed yesterday the thought for the day was in the paper, says, believe them who seek in truth, doubt them who find it. And you're talking about what God said. There's a bumper sticker some years ago said, God said it, I believe it, that settles it. Well, God said it and it's settled whether we believe it or not.
That's right. That's absolutely right. Okay, so Jesus says, I've done all these things in public. And I think that's significant too. I'm just going to mention this by way of apologetics. Was what Jesus did and what was accomplished and what God has revealed about it, were those things done in secret? And that's really significant because there are religious books that are written that there are a lot of things that transpired for which there is no evidence. Okay? And I say that's significant because the things that happen scripturally, a lot of those things can be seen in historical documents written by people who are not sympathetic to the cause of Christ. And that becomes important. When I look at certain kinds of apologetics things, I actually try to look on websites that are not Christian because I want to see someone else who sees some of those same things who is not sympathetic to the cause of Christ, because that, Christians make statements about things that were said or were done, and sometimes they mean well, but they don't verify their facts. And the end result is that it's actually what they claim was said or happened wasn't really true. And I don't think they were intentionally lying about it, but we don't always check our facts. And it's important that there be evidence for things we claim with regard to things that happen in the world. Because if something happened in a specific part of the world, what's likely is that not only did Christians write about it, there were probably other people who weren't Christians who wrote about the same kinds of events. And for example, Assyria and Babylon, they interacted with the people of Israel during the Old Testament history. Did the people of Babylon and Assyria have their own histories? What would you expect to happen if you compare the histories of Assyria and Babylon, or the Greeks, and the Israelites? Not that the Bible is purely a history book, but does it contain history? Does it contain historical facts? So if you compare those historical facts where there was interaction between those nations, what would you expect to find at some point? You would expect to find some overlapping details between the two. Guess what you find with the Bible? Guess what you find with the Bible? You find overlap between the two histories. Now, are they in complete agreement? You think the Assyrians made reference to the fact that when Sennacherib came up against the city of Jerusalem, that while he was encamped outside the gates, that overnight he lost 180,000 soldiers? Why wouldn't he write about that? History is typically written by who? The victors. Typically written by the victors.